All games have one thing in common, and it's this screen. One that signifies the end of one adventure and the start of another. But hidden behind this innocuous place is a question I can't get out of my head. In games and in life, is it ever truly game over?
Just like you said, just like you said, I've been a fool.
Fatality.
I've been a fool, just like you said.
For many of you watching this video, the first memories of games you have probably stem from somewhere like here, sitting in the warmth of your own home with a console connected to a TV screen. But you see, the origins of video games actually trace back to an even simpler time, one during the late 70s and early 80s where the first arcade games began to appear. Things like Space Invaders, Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, and Galaga, each of which brought large crowds of young teens and adults alike, all looking to spend hours standing in front of a box. The thing is though, these arcade games were very different from what we have today, because they weren't meant to be won. In Pac-Man, for example, the game technically has 256 levels, but that fact itself was only discovered when someone actually got to this final stage in 1999. Where it was unearthed that it was actually a kill screen, with a garbled mess of characters and code, making it nearly unplayable and impossible to progress further. Or in other words, Pac-Man and almost all arcade games were designed from the get-go to end when you died, not when you beat the game or any specific level. And that's a really important distinction. Whereas game over screens in modern titles are nothing more than momentary lulls towards an ultimate goal, a brief setback, at the dawn of the history of games, they were everything. Arcade games weren't made to tell a story or provide a rewarding conclusion. Rather, they were instruments of money extraction, forcing players to insert one coin after another, chasing the high score or win in the latest fighting game. For those of you who hate microtransactions nowadays in live service titles, don't forget just how money-hungry games were before, designed to never be won. And yet, over time, this status quo has changed. In our modern era, it's seldom we find titles that don't have some sort of ending or conclusion after many hours of play. And when you do die, all that happens is a game over screen pops up instructing you to load your latest save. But you see, that's the exact issue. If death means nothing, then by extension, so does game over. Before we had our money, our pride and ego, or our dignity on the line, playing in front of friends with a set amount of cash in arcades. But now, we are presented with a new conundrum, equally as terrifying, that itself brings forth a paradox of sorts. One that asks a simple question. In a world where game over isn't game over, what does anything matter? In my opinion, one of the greatest parts about being human is our infallibility, our capacity to be wrong over and over, fail again and again, only to carry on. But the primary reason failure like this even has an effect on us is because it's real. At every point in our lives during every day, there is a genuine and looming threat of catastrophic failure. If you fall asleep at the wheel of your car, you could cause massive harm. If you break under pressure at your job, you may get fired, and if you neglect your relationship with others, they will eventually leave you to your own devices. In games though, all of these stakes are for the most part gone. When you die in a title like Breath of the Wild, you aren't sent back hours or stripped of all your gear and achievements. Instead, you reload the most recent manual or autosave and try again. Even in games like Dark Souls, where death results in the loss of every soul you have gathered, potentially over hours, if you manage to make your way back to your body unscathed, you get everything back, like nothing ever happened. Systems like these are meant to encourage exploration, experimentation, and discovery, and they accomplish this to a great degree, allowing new adventures to take place at any moment on a new playthrough. But in doing so, they also take away something too, our ability to truly fail. Instead, in its place, casting an illusion of struggle. A perfect example of this comes from one of my favorite games of all time, Pillars of Eternity. At one point on your journey through the first game in the Deerwood, a war-torn forested region in Eora, you stumble upon a famed stronghold called Cad Nua. And under this castle of sorts is an ancient and challenging mega dungeon called the Endless Paths of Odd Nua, home to 15 sprawling dungeon levels, each harder and more fantastical than the last as you go deeper and deeper. And on each level there are countless traps, hidden treasures, and massive monsters. One room, for example, is nothing more than an elusive spike trap, which can kill your entire party almost instantly if you do not prepare the right spells or defenses, of which you might not even know about at this point in your playthrough. In real life, this would result in me walking away and figuring out a guaranteed plan in order to survive. After all, no sane person would sacrifice decades worth of a life lived at the small chance of a shiny gold piece or interesting lore. But because Pillars of Eternity is a modern video game, I knew I could simply throw my body and all those of my companions at the problem over and over again in order to try and figure it out. And each and every time I flung my poor frame at this room full of death and destruction, I was impaled instantly. But you know, none of that mattered, because I knew that in the absolute worst case, I could simply reload my save seconds before flinging myself into trouble. So it begs the question then, what is even the point of having failure states in a game over screens, when failure isn't even possible? By allowing players to sacrifice themselves over and over to figure out how to solve a problem without dying, you rob the player of the satisfaction of a true sense of accomplishment. After all, is an accomplishment even an accomplishment if there was no real chance of failure in the first place? The same problem occurs in other single-player RPGs as well, where making the wrong decision in dialogue can quickly be remedied by the press of a button, taking you back a minute before the crucial decision. And as strange as it sounds, if a decision is one that is not permanent or sufficiently cast in doubt, then let's be real with ourselves. It's not a decision at all. Game over screens in their modern implementation, by their very nature, fundamentally change how we view and play games and create a paradox. How can something be called a failure state or a game over screen if actual loss can never even occur? It's the same conundrum of being brave in the face of fear. Without the fear itself, there is no bravery. In fact, this is the exact argument that Aristotle made in his famed work Nicomachean Ethics, where he asserted that courage could only come from the mean between recklessness and cowardice. That only as a heroic response to our natural fears does bravery arise, because in the absence of fear, there was nothing to conquer at all. And by contrast, in games, without the potential of truly making the wrong decision with no ability to save yourself, all stakes are lost, and choice becomes nothing more than theatrics. But maybe the best example of this problem, of this paradox within the simple phrase, game over, is Baldur's Gate 3. My first playthrough of the title ever was characterized by an almost comical sense of reloading. I constantly would find myself looking at a game over screen or being unhappy with dialogue choices, after which I would quickly reload my nearest save and try again, this time making whatever alterations I needed for my desired outcome. And yes, this did result in things I wanted happening, with the right characters surviving, romances I was gunning for panning out, and combat encounters that could be conquered with ease, but none of this was actually satisfying. In an effort to craft the perfect playthrough, I robbed myself of something even better. And you know how I know that? It's because around a year later, many playthroughs past my first, I decided to try playing on Honor Mode for the first time. For those of you who don't know, Honor Mode in Baldur's Gate 3 is a game mode that was added to the experience post-release, that not only raises the difficulty of the game to the highest possible level, along with new custom abilities for each boss, but also, and much more importantly, doesn't allow save scumming. In Honor Mode, you are given only one save file that is updated at autosave points when quitting the game or if the save button is hit. Unlike most other ordinary save files though, in Honor Mode, you cannot ever reload to this point in time, and the save file itself serves as nothing more than a point of reference to send you back to in the event that you do in fact die and lose your entire Honor Mode playthrough, no matter how far into the game you already are, or obviously when loading to the game on a new day. This means that even small mistakes hundreds of hours into a playthrough right at the end means you can lose. Ask Wolfhard FPS, another YouTuber I highly recommend to you guys. He knows all too well about this fact. So as you can see, Honor Mode is a setting made for the most hardcore of players, but after trying my hand at it for an entire playthrough of my own, I actually think all players should be using this, especially on their first playthrough. Because when every decision in dialogue actually matters, when every combat encounter could be your last, the entire game world becomes so much more immersive and engaging. Every spell you would otherwise ignore, every game mechanic that you need to learn becomes that much more important, because in order to succeed, you must use everything at your disposal. For example, my Honor Mode playthrough was actually the first time I ever used the potion crafting system in-game, whereas in previous runs, I knew worst case scenario if I died I could just reload a save. In Honor Mode, I needed to get every advantage I could get, and part of that was crafting tons of healing or damage potions to use in any fight I thought I might struggle with. By including a mode where game over actually means game over, Baldur's Gate 3 goes from being just an amazing RPG to a truly visceral experience. However, the moment in my Honor Mode playthrough that truly proved this idea to me wasn't the new bosses and combat encounters or dialogue choices I already knew about. Rather, it came from something I had never actually done in any of my previous playthroughs: the hunt for the ancient and powerful weapon, the Blood of Lathander. During this questline in the Githyanki Creche, you must solve multiple puzzles in order to find a secret entrance to an underground lair that has multiple traps leading to a room with the weapon. But near the end of the main puzzles, in order to actually get into this hidden chamber, you must move some carefully placed statues in a connecting room, which will open up a trap door in the wall nearby, which you can walk through. I had never done this before, so each step in this puzzle was something I was actually solving for myself on the fly. That is, until disaster struck. One of the statues I had to move required a strength check, of which every single member in my party failed handsomely. In any other playthrough, I would have immediately reloaded my save and tried again until this worked. But this was Honor Mode. Failure means actual failure, and I didn't have a get out of jail free card now. For 30 minutes, I ran all around the Githyanki Creche looking for other buttons, hidden levers, or anything I could use to somehow get into the underground level hiding the Blood of Lathander. But over and over again, I was shut down. And honestly, it made me distraught and somewhat angry that something I had put so much effort and time into was now impossible to get to, and I was completely locked out. That is, until I hatched a plan. What if I could throw oil at the statue to lubricate it, giving me another chance to push it again? It seemed crazy at the time, but because of how open-ended Baldur's Gate 3 is and how much I wanted to get into this room, I used one of my characters to cast the grease spell on the statue, and without any strength check needed, it moved with ease. I cannot express just how powerful a moment like this is in any of the games we play. One where in the face of true and utter failure, you find a way to prevail anyways. And it made me realize that in any other playthrough, in Baldur's Gate 3 or all other RPGs alike, where save scumming is allowed, I could never again get a high quite like the one hunting the Blood of Lathander. And that's because the true beauty of this moment doesn't just come from the immaculate game design, but also a world where game over really does mean game over. Without exaggeration, until you play a game where consequences do genuinely matter, you don't realize how much you're missing out on by even having the ability to reload a save at any point, even if you don't use it. Simply knowing that actions have consequences makes the impact of the choices you make instantaneously more powerful, with nothing else changing at all. Or in other words, saving the princess or slaying the dragon is a great feeling, but much less great when the only thing that got you there was a copious amount of do-overs. The entire idea of game over or failure states in the first place was that they signified real loss, the actual end of a journey. But nowadays, they serve as quite the opposite, nothing more than a moment of reflection to gather our thoughts before we go back and easily best what before eluded us with no real consequences at all. Game over has gone from being the worst thing you could possibly see standing in an arcade, telling you that you now had to give up real money to play again all the way from the start, to being nothing but a slight annoyance at best. A world where game over quite literally means the exact opposite of the implied meaning in the words. But you see, this paradox isn't as completely nonsensical as I'm making it seem, because games aren't real life, and thus don't play by the same rules. One thing I've conveniently left out so far of my arguments as of yet is that despite my issues with the paradox modern game over implementations create, they also in many ways are a necessary evil. After all, no game is perfect, and because of this, game over screens don't only act as small transitions, but also moments to learn. The fact that games don't completely screw us over every time we die means that we are able to experiment with mechanics, learn new features, and slowly master the worlds before us. In many games, it's not even clear what works and what doesn't until you actually try it yourself. For instance, in a game like Prey from Arcane Studios, the most underrated game of all time by the way for those of you who haven't played it yet, check out my video on it if you haven't, the genius of the title is how little it actually tells the player. Half of the things you can do in game are discoveries you will make for yourself, and while that means they are much more rewarding when you do pull them off, it can also result in many instances where you try to do something that completely screws your playthrough. What if you transform into a small object and squeeze your way through a minuscule hole only to wind up on the other side with no side points to escape again or an inability to hit the right angle on the way out? What if you fire your last boltcaster bolt from within a room and it banks off the wall and hits the lock button on the door outside, trapping you forever? What if you use the glue cannon to carefully traverse your way to a high ledge, after which you fall into a small crevice with no more glue cannon ammo to wedge yourself out of? Situations like this in open-ended games similar to Prey can happen all the time, but usually they aren't a big issue at all. Simply reload your nearest save and don't do that again. But what would happen if Prey had honor mode like Baldur's Gate 3, and autosave the second you can find yourself in a small room? Well, then it would truly be game over. But that isn't very fun, is it? And even more concerning, it doesn't feel very fair either. Unless you've already played a game for hours on end through multiple playthroughs already, it's hard to judge what works and what doesn't, and you can easily wind up in situations that you didn't intend to at all. Not because of a lack of skill, but simply a lack of understanding or pure bad luck. Even though I loved Baldur's Gate 3's honor mode, I do admit that a lot of the experience would have been much more frustrating had I not already played the game multiple times, meaning I knew what to expect behind every corner. But again, I think back to the Blood of Lathander quest, one of the few I hadn't done yet, and how impactful that was, because I had to figure it out on the fly with no chance to try again. It seems as if both games with strict game over states and those completely without can work. So maybe the best solution to the game over paradox is actually one I hear quite often, that appears obvious when you say it out loud. Just give players the choice. Allow us to decide whether or not we want to take on the challenge of no save scumming, of truly being wrecked whenever we see a screen like this. But you see, I don't think this actually solves the problem. The real issue with game over screens nowadays is that games are being designed around them. Developers can be lazier in game design, bug fixing, and feature implementation because they know that if something does happen to go wrong for the player, they can just reload a save and ignore the game over screens since they are essentially pointless. Or said in a different way, game over has become nothing but a crutch to save games from themselves. I mean, really think about it. Think about the last time you died in a video game. What happened? Did it feel fair? And if it didn't feel fair, how pissed would you have been if the game crashed and removed your entire save file right after? Deaths in video games only feel rewarding when none of our control is taken away from us. For example, no one complains about dying to a boss in Elden Ring because it just means they need to get good, not that the boss is bugged and not working properly or an item stopped doing what it was supposed to. And yet, despite the fact that nothing feels worse than a death that you don't even understand or that wasn't fair, that doesn't mean that games that relish in the chance of this happening can't be better for it as well. I know games are about having fun, especially for most players, about the ability to just make whatever choices you want, reload saves when needed, and for the most part ignore game over states. But in cases like this, it's time we call a spade and realize that game over doesn't mean anything. From a design standpoint, it's simply lazy and boring. And instead, developers should be focusing on making the game more interesting and less paradoxical. Write lore into your story that explains that we're not in fact dying, but rewinding through time with space magic. Or from the ground up create gameplay loops that focus on death as a mechanic itself. Take a game like Hades, where every time you die you return to your base where characters will remark about your latest run, storylines and quests will progress, and new items will unlock, all because the cycle of life and death itself is baked into the experience of the game. This means you can not only learn from each death and mistake you make, constantly trying new builds or abilities you otherwise wouldn't have just to see how they work, but also you don't lose any immersion at all, meaning you could still get lost in this world while growing as a player. Games should allow players to experiment, to have fun, and play the way they want to from a product that they paid good money for. I get that, but don't ruin the immersion for those of us who want to take it more seriously too. Stop being lazy and design your games so that death is a core mechanic of how every single bit of functionality works. Because while games are primarily a form of entertainment, they also can be something so much more as well. Journeys that allow us to expose ourselves to truly engaging moments, that have the potential to raise the stakes in such a way that usually only our real lives do too. Because by removing the weight of game over and stripping it of any stakes, you also rob players of something that we all truly want: the ability to win. You know, recently I've been playing a ton of Stalker 2. It's my first Stalker game ever, and despite the bugs and issues with the A-Life system, I'm in love with this title. Every single step you take through this desolate wasteland is haunting. You can hear the leaves crumble under your boot, the sway of large cranes in the distance as they teeter on the edge of collapse, and the faint moans of strange creatures hidden in the dark. But what really makes Stalker so great is how gritty the world feels. Ammo is sparse, enemies are tanky and smart, and whenever a storm starts to fill the horizon, you know you must make your way to safety quickly lest you be swallowed by a sea of red death. In order to survive in this world, you must constantly be aware of your surroundings, of how much supplies you have left, and make sure you are prepared no matter where you go. If your gun jams in a tough fight, that might be game over. But you see, Stalker, just like many other games we have been talking about here, treats game over as yet another pointless screen, where if you die, you simply can reload your save. This one simple fact removes so much of the immersion in this game that is otherwise breathtaking. Because in any moment where I otherwise would have had to really think about what I was doing, I can just turn my brain off and charge onward since I know I can reload that save. And the best example I can think of for this was my first encounter with one of the scariest enemies in the game, the Burir. While I was making my way through a dark cave in the middle of a barren wasteland, I could hear ominous grunts to the left of me down a pitch black corridor. And when I shined my lights towards the noise, I was met with what looked like an old man hunched over in a cloak, now very angry with me. In Stalker, Burirs have the ability to not only telepathically knock your guns out of your hands while maintaining a shield across their body you cannot penetrate, they also can then grab your guns, or any others on the ground, and make them levitate in the air, after which they turn to you and unload as you run in fear. Fighting this enemy type for the first time was an extremely nerve-wracking experience, especially since I had never seen something like this before. And thus I had no idea how to beat them at first, and now that the enemy had taken my best gun, I simply ran back towards the entrance of the cave to regroup and figure out a plan. I thought over and over again about what to do, how to outsmart the enemy, to the point that I would sneak up to him and study what he was doing just to understand how to beat him. But just as I was becoming so immersed in this moment, so captivated by the challenge in front of me, I realized something. What the hell am I doing? Why don't I just bull rush this thing and use everything I have to incapacitate it? After all, worst case, if I die, I will just reload my save and keep doing that over and over till I figure it out. Luckily for me, I never died, and my rush towards the creature ended up with barely surviving and beating it. But by the time I was standing over its lifeless body with my favorite gun once again in my hands, I had a sick feeling in my stomach. I had just ruined what could have otherwise been an amazing, slow, methodical war with a monster I didn't understand. by instead just charging in without a care in the world, since game over doesn't mean anything in Stalker. And sure, you could add a permadeath or Iron Man mode where if you die it really is over, but even by giving players the choice to play Stalker in a mode where death doesn't mean anything, well, you rob them of the capacity to win. Because remember, as human beings, we always tend towards what is easiest. Even if you give us a chance to choose the hard path, eventually, given enough time, we will find a way to make it easier. So only by forcing difficulty on players can you actually immerse us in such a way. The entire ethos of the Stalker series in every other way is about permanence, about a harsh world that does not care about you. But all of these really interesting and immersive qualities simply fall to the wayside when none of it matters anyways. Made a mistake? Just reload the save. Have a super scary anomaly-ridden underground wasteland you want to jump into but you might need to prepare more? Nah, just jump in. Worst case, if it's too hard, just reload to another save before you actually made the jump. As you can see, there's no better way to kill immersion instantly than game over screens like this. I would much rather see Stalker 2 implement more persistence. Maybe whenever you die, you wake up in a nearby medical facility with some NPCs saying they found you barely alive, but now almost all of your ammo is gone and your favorite gun is broken. You don't even have to make death mean starting the entire game over from hour 1. Just make it so we as players have to actually think about what we're doing because the consequence of death is so great. Imagine how much more immersive Stalker 2 would be, a game that is already unbelievably captivating, if death meant a high chance of losing your best gear, or if story beats failing because you were gone in the interim. Because remember, there is no good without evil. There is no light without dark, and in the case of game over, there is no winning without real loss. Modern game over implementations or save scumming in games, by their very nature, ensure that we never actually lose, that the entire campaign can always play out exactly just how we want, treating us like little babies instead of adults. Because if anything can go our way at any moment, if any mistake can quickly be corrected as if it didn't happen, then that also means by extension, all of our wins are meaningless too. The entire reason doing things in games feels satisfying in the first place is that we as players feel like we had the agency to figure it out ourselves. In Baldur's Gate 3, when I solved the Blood of Lathander puzzle despite all of my failed strength checks, that felt great because the game had already shown me that I truly could fail this quest. I could make decisions or get unlucky and be locked out forever, and yet I figured out a way inside anyways. In Stalker, if I had known death actually meant something when fighting the Burir, I would have taken so much more time assessing the situation, planting traps, throwing grenades, testing the waters, and really figuring out the weaknesses of my enemy. It would have almost added an entire extra element to the gameplay and immersion of the experience, and made everything about that entire quest and encounter that much better. Instead of just being relieved that I no longer had to deal with annoying levitating guns, I would have been elated that I actually accomplished something meaningful, that I won, that I had a real victory. Not a hollow victory like we see in so many games, but one that means something because it stands in the face of a potentially catastrophic outcome on the other side, not just a game over screen with a simple reload button. Because at the end of the day, what does winning or beating a game even actually mean? Is it when we finish the campaign? When we climb to the top rank in a multiplayer shooter? When we 100% every achievement on offer? I don't think that's really what we are talking about on a deeper level when we say we beat a game. I think what most people are actually looking for is a mastery of sorts. Learning everything about the mechanics, about the lore of the world on offer, and knowing that no matter what obstacle you were to find, you have a deep understanding of the experience to such an extent that you could figure out a way to win. And that's because games as a medium serve as an analogy of sorts to our real lives, where true satisfaction and fulfillment don't come from cheap wins, but rather exerting effort into something meaningful that you can actually feel proud of mastering. The phrase, "no pain, no gain," isn't just a fun and inspiring message. It's a look into the human condition, into the idea that only through struggle can greatness be born. As Albert Camus argued in his famous papers on the myth of Sisyphus, the underlying message of the story of a man pushing a boulder up a hill endlessly for all of eternity is that that man is happier than anyone else. Only by looking struggle in its face and launching ourselves headfirst into it can we achieve true nirvana. And one of the best and most powerful aspects of games as an entertainment medium is that they are the only things besides our real life experiences that can achieve this, making us feel proud. Imagine if Dark Souls or Elden Ring had an easy mode. That would quite literally destroy the entire ethos of the experience. And people understand this. There are plenty of FromSoft defenders that would argue to the death that none of their games should have an easy mode, because if they did and someone actually used it, the entire thing would fall apart and lose purpose. But you see, for a lot of games nowadays, that same principle holds for game over states, but no one's talking about it. While some people argue that Dark Souls should have an easier difficulty, most of the adoring fanbase and high sales seem to argue otherwise, showing that by giving players choice, you don't always make a game better. Sometimes, less is more. By forcing players to see failure in games as an actually bad thing, the entire ensemble becomes that much better. Just like how Elden Ring being hard is crucial to what makes the game a masterpiece for so many people. Even in extremely trivial games like Super Mario 64, it isn't popular today because of how easy it was when it was first released. It's popular now because of a massive speedrunning community that works tirelessly every day to make new fastest times or discover ways to improve existing strategies. By our very nature, we are beings who crave struggle, and when we don't get it, we will even make arbitrary challenges just to justify our need for pain. Because in all of our hearts, we know that only through that pain can we be born again in pure bliss. The paradox of game over is not a mere oddity, it's a haunting revelation that in games where game over means nothing, nothing means anything. More than many people realize, games have the capacity to tell stories and provide experiences that live on with us forever. Not just because of amazing storytelling, immaculate writing, riveting gameplay, or genius systems and mechanics we haven't seen before, but because games also give us the one thing no other entertainment media can, something we only find in our real lives as well: agency. And by designing games where game over isn't game over, we rob not just ourselves, but our souls of being set free. Games should be about having fun. They should be about experimentation and learning, giving players the chance to really dive into systems and mechanics. But in an effort to craft journeys that are pleasurable, we must not forget that ironically, the greatest pleasures of all are only materialized out of great adversity. It's time game over really started meaning game over again, like the days of arcades and 80s rock and roll. However, that doesn't mean games should go back to being like the arcade romps of old. We can still allow players to experiment, to learn, to tell stories and have fun, while simultaneously designing game over states that actually have real consequence and weight while being integrated into the gameplay loop more seamlessly. And if I had one more idea to leave you with, that maybe more than any other example explains my point perfectly, it's Cyberpunk 2077 and its endings. For those of you who have played, you know that no matter what you do, no matter what choices you make, the game always ends in tragedy. You cannot save yourself, or on the slim chance that you do, all of those around you fall into hell, either literally or metaphorically. Despite the countless hours you put into each companion character, as well as your own, there are no happy endings in Night City. And yet, despite that, more than any other game I have ever played in my life, Cyberpunk is the title I think back on most. Not because of the amazing graphics and architecture or bombastic moment-to-moment gameplay, but because of the horror, the tragedy of it all. While I was distraught when I beat this game for the very first time, and angry that in a way it was all for nothing, the narrative decided to screw me no matter what I did. But despite all of that, the failure in the end really affected me, and I know it did for so many of you out there too. Because failure doesn't actually mean game over. In life and in games, no matter how hard we fall, no matter what mistakes we make, or decisions we lock ourselves into that result in a completely failed run. It is those failures that define us, that inspire us to try again and again until we prevail. The real paradox of game over is that it never even existed in the first place. Because deep within all of us is a spirit that refuses to ever stop. And by designing games with these cheap excuses for real failure, we rob everyone of finding that spirit inside all of us that will carry on no matter what. And as always, thanks for watching.